Dear students, today we are going to study the session 4 of Communication Skills Part 2, Unit 1, Employability Skills Part A. In the previous session, we have learned article writing. We have seen what an article is, how can we write an article, what is the format for writing an article, and what are the points to be kept in mind while writing the article. Now today we are going to study the various barriers that affect communication, that is the barriers to effective communication, their types and factors. So what do you mean by barriers? Barriers are basically the hurdles or the problems which are encountered and which affect the communication. So in order to make an effective communication, we have to overcome these barriers. Now first of all, we are going to go through the definition of communication. Literally, communication means sharing. In a simplified form, communication means sharing. If there is no sharing, there is no communication. Also, we have studied in the previous session about effective communication. Effective communication can happen if we follow the basic principles of professional communication skills, known as 7 C's of effective communication. We have studied the 7 C's and we have seen what role they play in an effective communication. These 7 C's of effective communication are clear, concise, concrete, correct, coherent, complete, and courteous. We have also seen what each of these means and what effect they have on the communication. Effective communication requires an understanding that a message is conveyed clearly between communicators in order that it is effective and serves the desired purpose. So these are the points which help in making an effective communication. The message which is conveyed between people must be clear. It must be conveyed clearly between communicators in order to make it effective and serve the desired purpose. So, whether in a team or with others, at work or in community, the communication environment is conducive and there are no barriers which prevent messages being sent and received successfully. So you must also ensure that there are no barriers while you are at work or in a community. You must ensure that the environment is favorable and there is no barrier to communication. Communication barriers create misunderstandings and misinterpretation of messages. That is the role barriers have to play, and that is why we need to overcome the barriers. So communication barriers lead to misunderstanding and misinterpretation of messages. To communicate successfully, you must know what barriers to communication exist and ensure that they do not obstruct. That is the sole purpose of studying barriers of communication, so that we can overcome them. What is a communication barrier? A communication barrier is anything that prevents us from receiving and understanding the message others use to convey their information, ideas, and thoughts. The biggest problem in communication is there are so many barriers or restrictions which are imposed upon communication which prevent an effective communication. So we have seen what actually communication is. We have also seen what effective communication means and what are the barriers of communication. So barriers are basically the hurdles or the restrictions which apply to communication and prevent it from being effective. We identified certain barriers to communication which prevent effective communication. They are physical barriers, language barriers, gender barriers, attitudinal barriers, perceptual barriers, cultural barriers, and emotional barriers. We are going to see them one by one what these barriers are and what impact do they have on communication, and how can we overcome or minimize these barriers in order to ensure effective communication. Physical barriers. So physical barriers separate people from each other and mark territories. So the physical distance between people, or the physical limitation between people, that is known as physical barriers. These barriers can often be seen in workplace, where offices and closed doors stop communication. Physical barriers can stop you from being comfortable communicating with a person whom you do not come face to face with often. So if you are not in face to face with somebody, then physical barriers may restrict you from communicating effectively. Language barriers. Using difficult words will stop your message from being conveyed. This is the biggest barrier. That is, two people speak different languages, or their accents, their dialects, they are different. Then proper communication cannot be done. If one is not familiar with your language, misinterpretation will occur. So if somebody doesn't know your language, then there can be a misinterpretation. The accent and dialect, use of words of people belonging to different places, differ. You must have also seen that English speaking people of different countries use different accent, and some of the accents are very difficult to comprehend. So the accents and dialects of people belonging to different places differ even if their language is same, and may become barriers to communication. Use of abbreviations can also be confusing and lead to misinterpretation. There are certain abbreviations which have different meaning in different languages, or in different cultures, or in different countries, or amongst different ethnicity or group of people, and they can be misinterpreted. Gender barriers. There are also some barriers which are imposed by the gender, which exist among masculine and feminine styles of communication. There are distinct differences between the speech patterns in a man and those in a woman. While women often emphasize politeness, empathy, and rapport building, male communication is also often more direct. This means that a man talks in a linear, logical, and compartmentalized way, whereas a woman talks more freely, mixing logic and emotion, features of both sides of the brain. So there is a physical barrier which is imposed due to the gender. So men and women, they have different types of expressions or different type of communication, and these barriers lead to gender barriers. Attitudinal barriers. Behaviors or perceptions that are divisive in nature. The ones that can lead to doubt, disagreement, or even conflict. They all interfere with and undermine communication. These are barriers that distance one from others. They are visible through withdrawal, meaningless rituals, which keep one devoid of real contact, superficial activities, and more. So it is the difference in the attitudes of people which lead to these barriers. Their behaviors, their perceptions, and their attitudes, which create a divide between people and prevent them from communicating. Perceptual barriers. Different worldviews can create misunderstandings. So different people have different view of the world, and they interpret things accordingly. People tend to interpret message from their own point of view or ideologies. Without thinking, one might only view a message from his or her own mindset rather than looking at it from another viewpoint. The problem with communicating with others is that we all see the world differently. So different kinds of people around different countries, different places, they have different perceptions and interpretation of messages. So the same message may be perceived or interpreted in different ways, and that can also create misunderstandings. And such barriers which are imposed due to the perception of different people, they are known as perceptual barriers. Cultural barriers. Ethnic, religious, and social differences can often create misunderstandings when trying to communicate. These differences can also affect one's perception and create confusion in getting a message. So different ethnicity and religion and social differences, these factors lead to cultural barriers. So since the culture of different people are different, there can be misunderstandings while communicating. Emotional barriers. If one is consumed with emotion, he will have difficulty in understanding what is communicated. If a person is consumed with emotion, he will have a difficulty in understanding what is communicated. Hostility, anger, fear, and other emotions make it hard to hear outside one's own self. So, if a person is carried away by emotions, understand the real meaning of the message, and the message is influenced by emotions, and the interpretation is done accordingly. Exercise 4.1. You have to answer these questions in your copy. We have studied different barriers of communication. Based upon what we have studied, you are supposed to fill in the blanks and write these fill in the blanks in your copy. First question is, not stating instructions clearly is an example of dash barrier. If the instructions are not clear, what type of barrier is it? Not understanding the customs or traditions of a speaker could mean there is a dash barrier. So if customs or traditions of a speaker is not understood, what kind of a barrier it is? Third, when you are overcome by your own feelings and unable to communicate well, it means there is an dash barrier. So if you are carried away by your feelings and you are not able to communicate, what kind of a barrier it is? Fourth, using slang or words that are used within your own social group is an example of dash barrier. So if you are using words that are peculiar to your own language, or slang, that is some informal words, so that belongs to your own social group, that is an example of dash barrier. You may like to have your own private cabin to work in, but if you are not willing to meet your team face to face, see here, you are not willing to meet your team face to face, that is, there is some hurdle. It is an indication of a dash barrier. You have a dash barrier if you think you are more qualified than others and are superior in knowledge. What kind of a barrier is it? If you think that you are superior to others in knowledge and you impose a restriction upon the communication. If you have a totally different viewpoint from your teammates on the way a training program is to be planned, you have a dash barrier. Again, you have a different viewpoint from the teammates in some training program, then what kind of a barrier is it? You can go through the videos once again and you can answer these questions, write it down in your copy, and you will be awarded marks later on. And also you may be asked to send a snapshot of these answers. Thank you.